So I'd like to say a little bit about how did life create a world that we could inhabit in the first place. So that's my biodiversity as creator, to really get to the fundamental point that we depend entirely on the prior biosphere for our very existence. So we depend existentially upon the biosphere. It is our life support system. It's not substitutable. That means we cannot replace it with something we can buy in the marketplace now or ever, I would assert. And then the second side is, how has biodiversity gone from being creator to victim? So how is the global change we're causing now threatening biodiversity? And could this even become an existential threat? Does anyone have a trouble with this mic? You can hear me. Okay.
The interpreter.
Okay, we'll go with this one. So I'm going to take you on a quick romp through Earth history in a minute. But let's start with a reminder that we live on an extraordinary planet, the atmosphere of which has been completely transformed by life and is actively maintained by the biosphere. So the Earth's atmosphere, with its 21% oxygen, is absolutely extraordinary. You know, our sister planet's atmosphere is close to thermodynamic disequilibrium, dominated by carbon dioxide. Instead, prior to our activities, carbon dioxide is a relatively trace part of the Earth's atmosphere, and it's life that's responsible for having drawn it down to part per million type concentrations. All that oxygen in our atmosphere is essentially a biological product, and obviously it needs to be near present levels for us to exist as thinking, conscious, mobile animal beings. Just to make the point that life's fundamentally transforming the atmosphere and fundamentally cycling elements on a phenomenal scale, you have on the left the fluxes of material in the form of gases exchanged between the Earth's surface and the atmosphere as we know it today. And notice the logarithmic scale compared to essentially without life is what comes out of volcanoes and metamorphic processes. So there are many gases there that are biogenic and not, there is no abiotic analog, and then the ones that do come out in small fluxes from volcanoes, but the fluxes, the matter exchange is so much greater due to the biosphere. And this is the signature of a phenomenal global recycling system of all major elements, associated compounds essential for life. So, as we launch into Earth history, I've got this horrible sort of spaghetti diagram. That's apt in Italy, isn't it? Spaghetti. We have above the line major changes in the Earth's environment over the 4.5 or so billion years of the planet, and below the line we have major transitions in the evolution of life. Doesn't really matter whether you can read it or not, because I'm going to take you through the kind of idiot's guide of Earth history. But amidst all of this, there are some arrows crossing from one side to the other, which is to emphasize that an Earth system thinker like myself and those in my field would describe it as the co-evolution of life and the non-living environment, in the sense that there's causal connections in both directions. So there are three major revolutionary transformations in the history of our planet that have taken us from an atmosphere devoid of oxygen and rich in carbon dioxide to one rich in oxygen and scarce in carbon dioxide, and with an associated radical change in the climate regulation of the planet. The first of those is the origin of life and of the biosphere and of that phenomenal type of recycling system we saw before. The second one is what I call the oxygen revolution, the first major rise in oxygen in the atmosphere, but as we'll see, not to modern levels. And the third is what I call the complexity revolution, which begins with the origin of eukaryote cells, but doesn't flourish until much later in the form of multicellular complex beings. So what do we know about the origin of the biosphere? It started remarkably quickly. The origin of life is possibly within 50 million years of the end of sterilizing impacts in what's called the late heavy bombardment. The interesting question for me, though, is not that observation that life started early, which is kind of stunning, but actually at what point did life get hold of the elemental cycles it needed to build its bodies and to exist? because you saw those mega fluxes coming in from volcanoes. If you just want to run a biosphere, taking what comes into this almost materially closed system and transforming it and making waste products and then doing nothing with the waste products, then the productivity of that biosphere is limited to less than 100,000th of what we see today. The reason the biosphere is stupendously productive now is because it is a phenomenal recycling system for all the materials it needs, using also, of course, the free energy of sunlight to power the whole system. So in my group, we've done some work 10 or more years ago just with generic models of model biospheres seeded with artificial life forms, which you can run thousands of times, and then you can ask questions like, how readily does a material recycling system emerge? Is it vulnerable to cheating, as an evolutionary theorist would call it, and so forth? And in a nutshell, the result is that the origin of closed material cycling loops is a very robust result in these artificial biospheres, and is quite resistant to natural selection breaking it down. It's more better seen as almost the natural product of natural selection. In these model biospheres, we can also ask questions about whether life would, in any generic sense, tend to start to regulate its environment, by which I mean not just the nutrient stuff out of which life builds its bodies, but other variables like temperature, which clearly influence life, but are not actually made into the material stuff of life. So when we expanded this model a little bit, we found some plausible mechanisms by which in the model worlds, life would come to regulate the non-nutrient environment. So you had mechanisms, kind of higher level selection mechanisms in the language of evolutionary theory, whereby it turned out that in model world at least, environment improving ecosystems would spread at the expense of environment degrading ones, even though the replication wasn't as faithful and heritable as it would be in standard natural selection. It's a kind of natural selection mechanism at the ecosystem scale. And the other thing we can do in this model world is we can also let life adapt to changing conditions as well as influence those conditions. And here you see a sort of summary of one of these artificial biospheres, if you like, in silico. And there's a lot of stuff on here, but there's if you just eyeball that, you can see long periods of stability interspersed with relatively short intervals of abrupt change. And that's the typical dynamic of how one of these systems will evolve. And at the bottom, you see the phylogeny of all life in the model biosphere, including some mass extinction events, you'll note, where many of the lineages end, and one of those is almost globally fatal. What I take from this is it gives some kind of template for how you would expect life and its planet to evolve in a generic sense. You might call it punctuated equilibria. There are long intervals of stable regulation, and then there are these shocking transitions. And so another interesting lesson to draw is that the abrupt transitions, they come about when, in this model world, life is able to access some resource that's sitting there in the environment and not being used by anyone. And then it creates new waste products which tend to go on and change the environment, or the climate, if you like, away from what everything has become adapted to over the preceding many, many generations. And then it becomes a game of whether life can evolve and keep up with the environmental change that's being caused by this particular, I call it, rebel species. And in this case, well, you sometimes have mass extinction at those transition points, and it's almost fatal. But the things causing the trouble, as long as they can keep up with the trouble they're causing, they can keep driving change. So if you can think about that in human terms and fossil fuels, you'll recognize an analogy. Anyway, as we move on through Earth history, we generally do see abrupt transformations at the planetary scale. And this next one, the oxygen revolution, is partly about that. These are red beds in southern Africa that are deposited in the aftermath of this fundamental switch from a reducing to an oxidizing atmosphere that happened about halfway through the history of our planet. And it ultimately comes down to biological innovation, the evolution of the kind of photosynthesis you're all familiar with, that splits water molecules and rejects oxygen as basically a waste product. That's called oxygenic photosynthesis. It's the most advanced form of photosynthesis, the most extraordinary one that wires together two photosystems in a single cell, and those photosystems apparently came from separate lineages of bacteria. It was incredibly improbable that that happened, but we wouldn't be here to talk about it if it hadn't happened. It took about a billion years for that metabolism to evolve in the first so-called cyanobacteria, and they're still amongst the major primary producers of the ocean, you know, responsible for tens of % of the total oxygen that we breathe even in today's world. So they evolved about 3 billion years ago, 2.7 at the latest. It was another few 100 million years, around 2.4 billion years ago, that oxygen rises by orders of magnitude in this thing, the Great Oxidation. Our understanding of that is it's like the whole Earth system went through a tipping point in the sense that there were two alternative stable states for oxygen, the oxygen balance and this whole surface of the planet, this sort of reducing world where oxygen's a trace gas, and what came after the oxidation, this oxidizing world, where it's the chemically kind of dominant constituent. And those two stable states are separated by the formation of the ozone layer and how that affects the overall oxygen balance and feedbacks in the system. We have a simple model of that, but it fits the data constraints, which I probably don't have time to explain to you, but you'll be thankful for that. But there are good geochemical constraints on oxygen levels before and after this fundamental transition, and this jump of orders of magnitude, and the simple model fits that pretty well. So we think the Earth went through a major tipping point at the Great Oxidation that, according to the model, could have unfolded within tens to hundreds of thousands of years, in case you're curious. Of course, we can't resolve that. It's precisely in the geologic record. So then we get towards something a bit more familiar. What comes after? Well, it's the rise of complex cells, and ultimately it's the rise of complex eukaryote cells being able to build truly complex multicellular beings like you and I. But this is a very long drawn-out revolution. So the oxygen rise creates a world in which the first eukaryotes appear to have evolved, and they use aerobic respiration as their core metabolism, just as you and I do. And that's kind of a powerful metabolism, as all biologists in the audience will know. It's a great way to get energy compared to breaking down the same food anaerobically. You get about, I don't know, 14 or 15 times as much energy. The first eukaryotes are pretty early, at about 2 billion years ago probably. It actually takes, at least 1.5 billion years before you get something recognizable like these fronds. These fossils are about 30 centimeters long. They're members of the Ediacaran fauna, as they're called, although no one's quite sure whether they're animals or not. They're about 600 million years old. In between, we're all puzzling over what held back the very slow evolution of eukaryotes. A lot of speculation about that, but what we do know is that oxygen was trapped at sort of low to us levels of between, let's say, 1 and 10% of the present level of oxygen. And that may have been a constraint, at least it would be a constraint against evolving large mobile animal forms, that's for sure. May not have been a constraint against evolving the first animal forms, which were sponges. But by the latest Proterozoic, as it's called, the late Middle Ages of the Earth, we have the first signs of the flourishing of complex life. This is in a world where those two vertical blue lines are snowball Earth events, so extreme radical changes in the Earth's climate, but also a world in which we have evidence that the ocean is partially, if not completely, oxygenating. So whilst the oxygen in the atmosphere has been there, in a sense, since the Great Oxidation, albeit at low levels, the deep ocean has remained largely anoxic until at this time it starts to oxygenate. And we see all these different complex eukaryote lineages starting to diversify and become apparent in the fossil record. And now we can talk a little bit about regulation, because what I'm really interested in here is how does complex life actually not just create, but help stabilize the world we're enjoying now? So among these complex life forms are animals that evolved to not just trundle around on the sediments at the bottom of the ocean, but to bioturbate them, that is to mix up the sediments. That has a chemical effect and a biological effect. It traps phosphorus in the sediments, but phosphorus is an ultimate limiting nutrient for productivity in the ocean. So these animals, these early animals, will have lowered nutrient levels, lowered productivity, and lowered the long-term source of oxygen which we geochemists talk about in terms of the burial of organic carbon. So they would have lowered atmospheric oxygen, therefore ultimately deoxygenating the ocean and limiting their own spread. And we have evidence for this being the case as we go through the Cambrian into the Ordovician periods, that animals are kind of self-limiting through this global feedback, negative feedback loop. So we don't get into a modern world and an atmosphere we could breathe until plants colonized the land, starting about 460 million years ago in the Ordovician period. This is artist's impression of a little later on, late Silurian or early Devonian ecosystem. But I've been working with colleagues trying to model how much of an effect the early plant biosphere would have had on global productivity. But what we can say now is, plant biosphere on land is basically doubled global productivity and doubled the global oxygen source. And we think that these earliest cryptogamic cover, a world of lichens and mosses and bryophytes, might have achieved something like 30% of modern productivity, even back in the Ordovician, which is the world you see here. And you can't read it, but in the bottom right, in this model world, you can play with species richness and show how species richness actually correlates to global productivity and the effect that the plants can have on weathering the rocks underneath them as their essential source of nutrients, phosphorus in particular. So why is that interesting? Well, basically, this doubling of global productivity is what's given us the modern atmosphere, the one with 21%-ish oxygen, the one that you and I can breathe. One of the ways that that's happened is because vegetation has mined rocks for phosphorus. Phosphorus is the ultimate limiting nutrient. That has supported more productivity both on land and in the ocean, more associated burial of dead organic matter. That's the long-term source of atmospheric oxygen. It's pushed up oxygen levels, created the first fossil charcoal and the first evidence of fires by the late Silurian around 420 million years ago. And ultimately, fires and high oxygen levels are both suppressing vegetation. The oxygen by its direct effect on rubisco and carbon fixation and photosynthesis. The fires, it's probably intuitive to you that is limiting global vegetation biomass, perhaps by as much as 50% today. So we have another negative feedback loop that we understand is pivotal in stabilizing oxygen near the high present levels for the ensuing 400 million years or so. There's just some model runs in green in particular, where when we put that kind of feedback in, we get a rise of oxygen with the rise of plants, and then we get a regulation within our kind of available constraints in the yellow horizontal lines up to the present. One more thing about weathering and plants. Plants weather rocks. They do this by making acids. This is essential to the long-term carbon cycle. This is basically the accelerated dissolving of rocks, silicate weathering. This is the long-term sink of carbon dioxide on the planet. And so plants have accelerated weathering by an order of magnitude. This has drawn down carbon dioxide levels by an order of magnitude, and it profoundly cooled the planet back in this Paleozoic era and created a series of glaciations. And that's also ultimately now self-limiting for plant productivity. The low CO2 levels and the relatively low temperatures, you could argue, also contributing to limiting vegetation productivity, and again closing a negative feedback loop that is the key regulator of the carbon cycle in the climate on long time scales. Little model result down there. Another slide coming up, which just shows a big drawdown of CO2 in models and in proxies with the rise of plants around 450 to 300 million years ago. And some subsequent fluctuations, but also a better regulated system since then. So, any evidence for this better regulation? I'm arguing that complex life has bestowed upon the Earth system. Well, I find it extremely interesting as a non-paleontologist to look at this plot of extinction rate. Again, it's the marine genera, as Neil explained to us yesterday, the best record. But this version of it would show you that even the background extinction rates are falling over Phanerozoic time, which might be interpreted as one signature of a system that's better regulated. Because here the disasters are, as Neil hinted yesterday, not just because some asteroid hits or some volcanoes go off. They're because there are other instabilities in the Earth's system that propel more devastating environmental change in response to perturbation. And one of those is that if you can begin to tip the ocean waters anoxic or devoid of oxygen, you see increased recycling of the nutrient phosphorus from the ocean sediments that supports more productivity, more dead bodies sinking through the water column, more oxygen demand at depth, and therefore more anoxia in a positive feedback loop that operates quite quickly in geological terms and tends to propel more anoxia in the ocean. So all these mass extinctions seem to show signs of fairly extreme ocean anoxia, and anoxia is obviously a great way of killing oxygen-breathing life forms. That sort of interacts with the slower negative feedback I was just describing, but it's just to introduce to you the idea that actually we can make simple models where we can tip the ocean from an oxygenated to an anoxic state just by, for example, increasing weathering rates and phosphorus levels in the ocean. We can get it back, but there's a hysteresis loop, there's a bistability in the system. Because there's a long-term negative feedback, the whole system can oscillate. It can kind of go round and round this loop if you hit it. And that might be what happened in the aftermath of the end Permian. Anyway, those are just to equip you with some thoughts about complex life, its role in Earth system stability. This is to say that just the last 650,000 years here, the ice core record, the very most recent bit of Earth history, it's this fantastic sawtooth oscillation, right, from short-lived interglacials to deep glacial conditions and then snap out of the ice age into another interglacial. This is the classic sign of an unstable system. No electrical engineer would look at this trace from the ice cores and say we had a nice stable climate. They would say, here is a system where amplifying positive feedback processes are beginning to become really important in the dynamics, and they're sort of battling with negative feedback processes which keep the system bounded. But this is unusual. This is an anomaly in terms of the geologic record. The current depth and fluctuations of ice ages are not the norm. And it's just in such an unstable world, unusually unstable, that we come along and pump up the carbon dioxide levels to 405 parts per million now, and whatever it's going to be, but by 2050 it'll be potentially over 500, that's for sure. So this is a segue then into the second part of the talk, how have us humans, who could only evolve thanks to past life, how are we making a mess of the system now? How big a mess and how big a problem for biodiversity? So some of you may be familiar with this, but this is just to say that the global temperature change we're going to create is essentially a linear function of the total amount of carbon we emit to the atmosphere as CO2, so our cumulative burning and emission of fossil fuels. For every 500 billion tons of carbon emitted, we get about a degree of warming. There's some dots on here, which maybe you can read, maybe you can't, but they span the different range of scenarios for this century between about restricting the cumulative fossil fuel burning to less than 1,000 billion tons of carbon and keeping the temperature under 2 degrees, or marching on with business as usual up to 5 degrees of warming. And that's not the end of it, right? So this is just to show you beyond 2100. We've got anywhere between 1.5, 2 degrees on the century time scale up to 4, 5 degrees. But especially in the high emission scenarios, it carries on up. It could go to 8, 10 degrees of warming in a couple of centuries if we're really intent on burning all the coal we know is there in the ground. Whether we could do that without catastrophic feedbacks kicking in is another matter, but it's sort of physically conceivable that we could create 10 degrees of global warming if we were that stupid. So I think Partha would like me to say a bit about where are we on current governmental commitments in terms of are we going to meet the Paris 2-degree target, let alone the 1.5-degree target. And this slide is just showing what happens if you add up the national voluntary intentional contributions of the USA, the EU bloc and China, the green, blue and the peach, and you contrast that with what global emissions, everybody's emissions, have to do to stay within 2 degrees of warming. That's the black line. And you see that there's nothing left for the rest of the world at 2030 if you just take the intended contributions of those major emitters. So clearly we're nowhere near making the commitments, let alone having the action to stay on a 2-degree trajectory. But I suspect you knew that anyway. So let's talk about biodiversity loss in this context. Remind ourselves that we already started causing extinctions. We heard about them this morning. Megafauna extinctions began and happened during the last ice age and deglaciation. And although there's some climate signature in there, the predominant cause was direct killing by people, hunting. So in that light, I'm kind of sympathetic to where Charles is coming from. When I first saw projections that climate change was going to eliminate masses of species, as a scientist, I was questioning that, because I knew that past abrupt climate changes hadn't eliminated masses of species. That said, I have to come here and represent the state of the evidence, and there have been many studies of many different types, and this is a meta-analysis of those, I know, hundreds of studies by different ecologists and modelers by Mark Urban, and it's a nice summary, and it basically says when you do a meta-analysis of all the studies of extinction risk from climate change, there is an extinction risk. It's around the 10% level, order of magnitude, and it does go up as temperature goes up, and Urban argues it goes up non-linearly, as this shows, this grey shaded area and the black line. And all the blue dots are different studies, just to give you an idea of the kind of scatter on this. But if we want to get into a discussion about the theory behind this, it's basically the same theory, species-area relationships or the like, that would be the same theory behind our understanding of how land use change and habitat change affects biodiversity. It's not some radically different theory. It's all internally consistent, and the whole point is all these global changes are interacting together anyway. And the reason climate change is a mega problem, perhaps, is because of the land use change and the elimination of those corridors that Stuart taught us about yesterday. So yeah, climate change is a risk to advanced multicellular life forms on land. It's one of several risks due to human activities. This just breaks down from Urban the different studies. Maybe we can come back to it in the questions if you want to delve into, how does this predicted extinction risk depend on which group of organisms, and there is a line for plants there, but mostly these are animals, and they're not spanning all animals either. It depends on different model types, dispersal assumptions, etc. But the point is it's a significant risk. I'm kind of interested, though, at the larger scale. I mean, species loss, it's profoundly important. I wouldn't be here if I didn't think that. But there's also systemic risk in the Earth system. We know bits of the Earth system are not, don't have a single stable state. They have alternative configurations they could be switched into. And there are tipping points you could pass that commit you or commit bits of the system to being tipped into these alternative states, slowly or quickly, depending on the dynamics of the system in question. But that's something I've been working on for 10 years or so, just trying to map out what are the potential tipping points in the Earth system. And you'll notice that some of these are kind of colored green, and that's because they involve the biosphere. There is the possibility we could tip much larger structural scales of change in whole biomes, let alone ecosystems, and that would obviously have knock-on biodiversity consequences. We can say something about where potential tipping points are in terms of the global warming required to tip certain systems, and that's kind of color-coded on here. They're not all at the same temperature, you wouldn't expect that. Some are further than others, some are closer than others. Just to say a bit about one of them, it's a result from a model. It's not the result from all models, but in some models, arguably some of the better models for how the climate develops, it dries systematically over the Amazon basin, fires become more frequent, and that has the potential to tip the forest from a rainforest to something else, which we can debate exactly what the something else is. In the model, the original model, it was like a savanna. Experts have been kind of elicited on what they think about the likelihood of this particular tipping point, as they have for many of the others. I'm not saying it will happen, but it's something that mechanistically there's some sound reasonable theory behind. It would sort of predicate on the idea that the forest in some sense creates its own climate and is to some degree self-supporting, and it also suppresses fires and the disturbance regime that would otherwise support the grassland. And it's conceptually reasonable that you could tip between different vegetation states in this large area of the planet, and this is true for several other areas of the planet. I was going to give a marine example, but I didn't get my coral reef slide together in time, but Jane talked a bit about those yesterday. Coral reefs could reach over large scales somewhat synchronously a threshold for loss. This is something a bit different. This is kind of going back to projections of what, again, are largely projections of animal diversity change by Gregory Bogrand, he's called, and his group. They've been doing some interesting work on that. A little difficult to read. You've got kind of progressively stronger warming scenarios going downwards, and surprise, surprise, progressively more biodiversity change as you work your way downwards on these plots. That's interesting, very interesting, but I'm interested in the primary producers in the ocean as well. What are they? Well, they're microbes, they're phytoplankton, they're single-celled cyanobacteria, or they're single-celled eukaryotic algae. Do we think that they're going to be made extinct by ocean warming? To first cut, no. These are organisms with quite a considerable power to acclimate to changing environmental conditions. And those populations of these organisms can also adapt genetically pretty quickly relative to trees or humans or other animals. Still, that doesn't mean it doesn't matter, because actually we've been working on this. We would predict under a changing climate there'll be fundamental changes in the composition of the phytoplankton, by which I mean not the ecological composition here, but the actual elemental composition of individual cells. So in this case, we need to think about how a simple phytoplankton cell has got some photosynthesis machinery. That's rich in proteins that are rich in nitrogen. It has some what we'd call biosynthesis machinery, like we all do. That's nucleic acids, RNA and DNA, that's rich in phosphorus. And the cell has some structure in which all that's contained, which is kind of rich in carbon and not very nutrient rich. In a warmer world, physiologically, these little single-celled organisms, basically their biosynthesis, the manufacture of the rest of the cell, works faster, works better, and you need less what are called ribosomes, ribosomal RNA, to make everything else in the cell. So you need less of the phosphorus-rich stuff to make all the nitrogen-rich, proteinaceous machinery of the rest of the cell. And in a nutshell, that means we predict, I think quite robustly, that the nitrogen to phosphorus ratio of the individual cells of phytoplankton in the ocean should go up as the temperature goes up. And that's what these plots are about. And maybe you're sat there thinking, well, why the hell does that matter? But this is fundamental. I mean, with the nitrogen to phosphorus level, changes also the ratio of phosphorus to carbon in the organism. This amounts to changing what's called the biological carbon pump in the ocean and the literal composition of this. It means changing the ocean nitrogen cycle fundamentally, because if you have now organisms with a higher demand for nitrogen relative to phosphorus, we expect the ecosystem to upregulate nitrogen fixation. You're talking about fundamental shifts in the core kind of biogeochemical workings of a major part of the planetary machinery that are quite, I think, predictable and understandable in mechanistic terms. So it's not about extinction, but it's a functional ecological change, right? So let me step out again onto slightly longer timescales, because I mentioned that in Earth history, I think that many paleontologists and geochemists have made the case that the ocean going anoxic is a sort of Achilles heel or weakness in the Earth system and is a major player in past extinction events. So you might, if you're thinking about existential threats, ask yourself, could we possibly trigger an ocean anoxic event? So we're stepping aside from climate change here for a minute. We're talking about another global change. And we've done some work recently where we said, well, we know what the known phosphate rock reserves are that we currently mine and refine and put on the fields as fertilizer, and most of that phosphorus ends up washed into the ocean. What if we just assume we're going to mine, refine, and fertilize the fields with all that rock phosphate? How much anoxia in the ocean would that ultimately drive by driving up productivity and oxygen demand? And on top of that, we recognize that the climate is getting warmer. That means weathering rates, natural weathering rates of phosphorus are going up. So what if we make some reasonable assumptions about how that will change? Could we tip the ocean anoxic? Initially, I was skeptical, but I'm afraid the model says we could within about 1,000 years, which is stunningly short by geologic timescales. And here we're talking about a doubling time for the anoxic fraction, as we call it, of the ocean, that's in the range of 150 years. So currently only 0.25% of the ocean floor is under anoxic waters, but that could double every century or so and tip you anoxic on a 1,000-year timescale. And once you go anoxic, because of the two alternative stable states and the feedback dynamics I showed you earlier, you stay anoxic. Even if you switch the forcing off, you stay anoxic for like 100,000 years in the model before it eventually recovers. I used a log timescale on the bottom to try and fit all of that in. And if you're wondering about, the long tail of fossil fuel burning and the climate perturbation, we have a pretty solid understanding. It's kind of common knowledge in my field that a fraction of the carbon we emit to the atmosphere is very long-lived, and the natural processes that remove carbon from the atmosphere take the order of hundreds of thousands of years to finally get rid of what we call the anthropogenic perturbation. So that's the timescale of the silicate weathering process I mentioned briefly earlier, that is amplified by plants, and this is the key long-term carbon cycle and climate regulator. So we expect a major fossil fuel burning event to leave a climate legacy for hundreds of thousands of years that will undoubtedly prevent the next ice age and perhaps several after that. Then we get to the biggest existential question. Is there actually a fundamental risk that there's another state of the whole planet that's hotter without complex life, essentially, and without all those weathering effects and all those other effects of complex life? And if there is, how hard do you have to hit the system to get there from here? And that's a paper I published now like more than 15 years ago that probably none of you have read, but with Werner von Blow. But we had a model which had, at the present, two alternative states for the Earth's temperature. The biotic is the one with complex life and weathering, plants, animals, blah, blah, blah. Abiotic would still actually be microbial world, I think, but it'd be fundamentally different land surface with no complex life and none of its effects on weathering, and much hotter because of it. And we calculated it took about 25,000 billion tons of carbon perturbation to switch you between the stable states. That might be a source of comfort, but it's only about 5 times more than the conventional fossil fuel reserves that we know about now. So it's sort of in the same order of magnitude of what we know we're capable of. So I'd take that as a slightly alarming result. Oh, and if you're curious, we carry on 1 billion years into the future here and make a fairly standard prediction of the natural lifespan of the biosphere of the lifespan of the complex life biosphere. Many studies agree that that would be about 1 billion years into the future, the natural lifespan of complex life. Well, we would foreshorten that considerably if we went down that path. So let us summarize. Microbes still play a central role in running all the major biogeochemical cycles that sustain life. I think they have considerable adaptive capacity. They're not the ones I'm most worried about coming to this meeting, and I'm sure you aren't, because the field just generally ignores them, to be frank, on biodiversity threats. Multicellular eukaryotes, however, animals, plants, fungi, I've tried to say something about how they play a pretty important role in creating and maintaining this oxygen-rich, carbon dioxide poor, cool and stable world in which, frankly, a lot of complex terrestrial life, including us, has been able to evolve. And yet those are the same organisms that we do agree are under considerable extinction threat. And so I'm making the case that this is an existential threat, potentially, in the sense that we're really talking about a threat to our life support system. I'm sorry the slides are gone, because now I have to try and remember what my last bullet point was, which is a real test, isn't it? Is it because I've touched something, or just because the nice man has switched it off? This is a bad time to be perturbing the Earth system, right? I showed you these ice age cycles that have happened recently. They're very unusual, and they're a real sign of instability. And therefore there's a sort of first-order simple reason to be thinking about the possibility of large-scale tipping points and the possibility of those in the Earth system. And they have the capacity to be a greater risk of triggering mass extinction, for example, that tipping point of a global ocean anoxic event, than the steady loss of species. I'm not saying it will happen. You've seen the timescales and the conditions on what it would take for it to happen, but it's not an impossible risk, and so it's one worth bearing in mind. I think I'll leave it there. Thanks.